One of the most common questions I get regarding Photoshop is how to get the best possible image. How do I take advantage of the adjustment layers or Photoshop's controls to get a better photograph? And I always tell people, it's really up to you and what you want out of the photograph. What do you want to communicate with the photograph as to how you're going to approach it? There's no right or wrong answer to how you use your controls, and that's maybe one of the frustrating things about artistic choices. But what I want to do in this tutorial is to take a look at two of three, I think, the most important adjustments you're going to make with your photographs, and those are contrast and value. The third would be color, and since I've eliminated color from this equation, we're going to focus on contrast and value. But these three things, I think, are the most important in terms of general controls that you have at your disposal, that and maybe cropping, when it comes to readjusting your photograph. And what I suggest people do is to take a look at contrast and value in terms of what they want to communicate. Do you want an image that pops? Do you want an image that really kind of draws the eye in? Or do you want an image that is a little bit washed out, a little bit faded? Do you want something that represents all the tonalities very well? Or do you want something that just has more visual punch? So there's advantages and disadvantages to low contrast and high contrast images. And you can have both in the same image. Don't forget, layer masks allow us a lot of flexibility in terms of putting one part of the image at low contrast and another part of the image at high contrast, and helping to direct the viewer's eye in that way. When it comes to value, again, do you want an image that's really moody? Do you want it to be a little bit dark? Do you want it to be a bit washed out and brighter? What kind of values are you looking for in your image in terms of how dark or how light do you want it? Well, let's take a look at a couple adjustment layers. The first one I'm going to start with is one of the most fundamental and one of the adjustment layers that people turn to first in Photoshop, and that's called levels. And levels is a very powerful tool, and we're going to take a look at some of the reasons why. The center box here, labeled input levels, is really a histogram that is a chart that kind of dictates or tells you where your pixels lie. This is kind of a roadmap to your image in terms of value. So over here on the left, I've got the shadows, and over here on the right, I've got the highlights. And you can see by looking at this histogram, I've got quite a few midtones and shadows down here. You can see this big mountain represents all the midtones and darker gray tones. All right. Then I've got kind of a gap, not a whole lot happening right in the direct middle. And then I've got another spike in terms of the lighter colors and the highlights, and that's probably more to do with the sky area and the clouds and in that region. Now on either side of that, I've got a couple gaps. I've got a big gaping gap here for my shadows and rather thin gap over here on the right in terms of my highlights. What that tells me is that my histogram doesn't extend all the way across the board. In other words, I've got 255 levels of gray, 0 to 255, from left to right. And in that left to right panorama, I'm missing something here on both the left side and the right side in terms of value. In other words, I have to go over about 27 columns before I even hit the first shadow pixel, or my darkest pixel in the area. I shouldn't say shadow pixel, because what I want to talk about next are these input sliders. Okay, and these represent three categories in your in terms of your value. So I've got shadows, which is represented by the black pixel, appropriately enough. I've got midtones, which is the middle gray, and then I've got highlights represented by white. What this allows you to do is allows you to redistribute the darker pixels or lighter pixels or middle pixels according to where you want them to be. So for example, my darkest pixel, if I want to figure out where those are, I can hold down the Alt key and drag this little slider. And as I drag it to the right, I'm gradually going to where the pixels actually lie. And you can see, again, that's right around 27. And there I can see that first click, that first row, those are where my darkest pixels in the image lie. Okay, that's a roadmap to show me. That's kind of just a little secret X marks the spot kind of way to find out where are the darkest pixels in your image. And there they are. Okay, so with that information, I can go and realize that, okay, my darkest pixels are in this shadow area, kind of scattered around in that kind of pit there. Well, that tells me that when my input slider is over here, there's a large gap between what Photoshop is saying is the darkest pixel and where my darkest pixels actually lie. Okay, so I want to close that gap. The reason I want to do that is because right now my darkest pixels are not being represented by Photoshop as pure black. Okay, and I want them to be. So I'm going to slide this over, and you can see as I do that, the image gets darker and darker. And now when I reached row 27, I finally reached my destination, because now those dark pixels, these ones here, are now being represented as pure black. Okay, and so that improves the shadow quality of my image as a whole. Now I want to do the same thing with my highlights, and drag this down. I'm going to go ahead and just hold down my Alt key again and just see where my highlights are at, and let's see if I can do this without blocking your view. And there they are. I can see the lightest parts of my pixels, lightest pixels in my image are up there at the top. And there they start to creep in, and I can start to see they're all in the sky, and they're right up there where those clouds are, basically, those little cloud formations. So if I were to drop this below a certain point, in other words, you can see from this thin line, there are some pixels there, and we saw those pixels, just a few, that are, being represented as pure white. Now, maybe not as many as I'd like, so I may just sort of decide to drop this white highlight slider down a bit until it reaches the vast majority of those pixels up there. The drawback with that is I sort of cut off all of these up on top of that, and I sort of make those go overblown and overexposed, and maybe lose some detail there, but that's okay. I'm willing to do that in my clouds. They're kind of the vast distance in the back. And before you know it, look, I've already, just by pushing those two sliders in, I've already got a majorly improved contrast here as far as getting some punch goes. But this is where I have to make decisions. I have to decide, is that improvement really an improvement? In other words, do I want high contrast? Do I want something that's flatter, or an image that looks like this? Okay. Some might argue that yes, it does lack a little bit of punch, but maybe the details are what I like, or maybe I'm looking for kind of a washed out look. I don't know. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just that most people want good contrast in their image. Most people want a bit of punch. So I guess if I had to choose one or the other, high contrast or low contrast, I would say most people are going to choose high contrast over the other, or at least medium contrast. But you can see, I think the image becomes much more dramatic with the contrast levels increased. But anyway, that's enough about contrast. Let's talk a little bit about value. Here with the midtones, we've got the middle gray slider, and I can drop this down. And you notice when I go to the left, that redistributes the shadow areas into the more neutral middle gray area. Okay, so I'm redistributing the shadows and making the image lighter as a whole. If I go to the right, I'm redistributing the highlights, and now I'm darkening those to the point where we really can't see much. So I don't know how much I'd really want to move this. You'd probably want to stay pretty much where it began for this particular photograph, but this, of course, varies from image to image. All right. Now, in the advanced class, I'd take this a bit further, and I'd go over some advanced image editing techniques for landscapes, dealing with this levels dialog box, and it gets kind of complicated and kind of involved, but I'm going to stick to that, to what we just talked about so far. I'm going to leave it at that for this exercise, because I think we've discussed what's important with levels for you guys right now. One other thing I'll mention is that there is a button called here called Auto Levels, and it is designed primarily as a means of quickly getting the levels distributed, hopefully in a way that's going to make the image more pleasing. And sometimes it redistributes those pixels very well, sometimes it does not. It's really kind of hit and miss, so you can try it and see if you like it, and if not, you can always dump it. At any rate, let's go ahead and cancel this one. just because I'm just doing that as a demo. And what I'll do now is to go and bring up curves. Let's talk a little bit about how we might use this to improve contrast. Now with curves in CS3, we've got a histogram built in. Now in the past, if you're not using CS3 or if you're using an earlier version, you can bring up the histogram window, which brings up a histogram that is live and interactive, and so it does work in conjunction with the curves dialog box. But the nice thing about CS3 is they put the histogram built in now to the background, which has been needed for a while. And now we've got something that may look a little less confusing to you, or maybe looks worse than the levels did. I don't know which, but at any rate, let me try and explain it to you. With curves, we've got, again, the shadows, midtones, and highlights all charted out from left to right. But now, instead of the sliders, what we've got here to control is this diagonal line, okay, going from left to right, which represents things as they are right now. The more I edit this line, the more I make adjustments to it, the more the contrast and value information is going to change. How is it going to change? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. First off, on the left, I've got my shadow, let's call it a anchor point. I'm going to draw this anchor point over to the right a little bit, and you can see I'm getting the same results I just saw with levels. I'm darkening those shadows because I'm basically taking this anchor point of the shadows and moving it over to where the histogram begins. And you can see now the input slider is also shifted over. Okay, just like we saw with levels, I got a little slider there. So I can do the same thing with the slider as I can with the little anchor point up here. I can either drag the anchor point or drag the slider. Either way, and I can sort of improve my contrast right away, just like I did with levels. Now the diagonal line's a bit steeper. Now one nice thing with curves that's pretty interesting is that you can take the Alt-Option key with your keyboard, hold it down, and you'll get the eyedropper. And with the eyedropper, you can click and drag and find any pixel in the image and see it on the right there. If you watch me as I drag, you can see it interactively move up and down that diagonal line to tell me where that image lies on the histogram or on the curve. So say, for example, the horse sign here, the middle gray tone is right there in middle gray. The shadow parts of it go a little bit deeper, a little bit darker on the left. And then you can see, of course, the shadow area goes way down there, and the clouds are going to be way there up at the top. So this tells me if I'm looking for a particular part of the image, maybe it's someone's face, maybe it's a particular car that I want people to notice, and I want to tweak that. I want to increase the contrast, I want to increase the value or darken it or lighten it. I can find that exact pixel on the chart and I can then edit it. And I can say, for example, okay, that's more or less where the sign is. I want to lighten the sign a little bit, so I can now just kind of come over here and just from memory, click on where it was, where that little dot was, and just simply drag up to lighten or drag down to darken. Now, of course, it's going to adjust the entire image. It's not just affecting the sign, but I was able to pinpoint the shade that was most important to me in the histogram to edit. Okay, and so when I drag it up and to the right, I'm getting a much lighter version. I'm redistributing those pixels into the light portion. And if I drag down to the right, I'm darkening the image. Okay. All right, just to point that out. Now, if I go in the middle, I can create what's often called an S-curve. An S-curve in Photoshop is really just a curve in the shape of an S, which tends to increase contrast. And so how it works is you plot a point there in the middle of, you see these grids, these grid lines there. I'm plotting this point right there in the middle. And then I'm following these grids down here to the next point, and then the next point up here. So I've got 3 points. And what I do basically is just pull this one down and pull this one up. All right, and that gives me the S curve that that you'll hear oftentimes people refer to. And notice how dramatic my contrast is now. My shadows are probably a little too dark for my taste, but the contrast is really creating a lot of punch. So I can take the midtones up and make them brighter, and the highlights brighter. but I've still got that S shape, which is giving me the increase in contrast, very dramatic contrast range. And there are a lot of people that use Photoshop that use curves for nothing more than this S curve, and to get in there and just tweak contrast. I'd say as far as adjusting contrast goes, curves may be the most popular dialog box that's out there. When it comes to value information, maybe levels is a little more popular, but people, as you've just seen, people can do a lot with either tool. And what you choose is really up to you, what makes you feel more comfortable. Photoshop, as we know, gives you a lot of possibilities of editing the same for the same results with different tools, and so it's really up to you as to how you decide to approach it. But I think if you use both curves and levels, you'll find that in certain situations both are valuable tools. Okay, let's go ahead and just accept that as curve. And even though it's a bit strong in terms of contrast, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that for now for this tutorial. What I'd like you to do is to save this file out with the curves intact and turn it into me. Just go ahead and save it as horse sign is the original name. And that's it. We'll see you on the next tutorial, and we will be revisiting curves and levels on other tutorials.